Hello, everybody. Welcome to the training, learning, and development community. Thanks for joining us today. Happy Tuesday to all of you. Welcome. We've got a few people already in the live audience. We've got Joe's here and Adam. Hey, Adam. Susan, nice to see you. Cheryl, Kim, Teresa, Christiana on our van life adventures. Maria, Eric, LV, Peggy, JG, Joe Steuben, Nike. Thanks for joining us today. So, this is kind of a popular topic, I have to say. Over the last few days, I've been seeing a ton of registrations come in for this one. How to think like a data scientist without being one. And no math or coding experience required, which I know for many of us, that's super helpful. And I'd like to introduce all of you to, oh my gosh, I'm not even sure. I have been pronouncing your name Anja. Is that correct?
No, it's Anja.
Anja. Okay, sorry. It's Anja. In my head, I've been saying Anja, but Anja and I have been chatting for a while, and it's really interesting. Some of the things that the sort of the career that she's after right now. She's looking and interested in projects that involve more learning and data analytics. Currently, you're working in the finance services. And so I'm sure that over there you have to deal with a lot of data and learning analytics, and you've done a lot of L&D types of things in the past. And you're going to talk a little bit about how to get into data science without actually being a math expert. So with that, why don't you go ahead and just take it away? I'm going to go and minimize my my camera, and I'll pop in and out as we have questions.
Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that. And I want to make you aware of a poll question that I would love to have some feedback from you. And that's already in there. And then also I asked a question about what data issues or topics you're struggling with right now. Let me
and I can pop up too. I just want to let you know I can read off like the poll answers and how it's kind of going. And the question is, do you need to become more confident dealing with data in your job? And folks, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little thing you can click to answer the poll. Looks like it's about half and half right now. And actually now it's three. The yes is winning by like 75%. So it looks like there are people that are interested in definitely becoming more confident with dealing with data in the job. And then if you guys can't see it, the question that Anja was asking was what data issue topic are you struggling with in your job currently? And I can see there's a couple answers coming in. I'm going to go ahead and post that in the Q&A area as well so that you guys can have it. But sorry for the interruption. Go ahead.
That's okay. Okay. Let me just get back on my screen here. Yeah. So let me just give you a quick background of how I got into all of this. I'm actually, I'm a trained philosopher, which sounds better than it actually is. But essentially, I studied philosophy in undergrad and graduate school. And that kind of gave me a pretty good background for thinking about the fundamentals and thinking about the underlying assumptions of things. And I actually was never strong with numbers. Math, I loved math. I just wasn't really good at it. And partly that has actually to do with a learning difficulty where I just couldn't, I would jumble numbers a lot, and I couldn't sometimes just make sense of numbers that were on a screen or on paper. And so over the years, I've kind of developed some workarounds with that. But those things were somewhat confidence shattering to me in the numbers department. But studying philosophy helped me put some underlying framework to numbers that help me deal with them in a more productive way. So, it doesn't, and I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way, when you look at numbers that are just there, it's hard to sometimes make sense of them without any context. And once you get some context and you start figuring out some insights from them, everything kind of starts falling into place. And that was what philosophy helped me do in terms of dealing with quantitative things, with numbers and data-driven insights. And so that's a little bit of the background. How I got into data science in particular was I've been dealing with data in most of my jobs, really, and I'm really passionate about it. So eventually I decided to pursue it more academically, and I'm just finishing up data science graduate certificate at University of San Diego. So I have the practicum left, and it's just been a wild ride, let's put it that way. I've always been in some kind of training capacity, whether it's accidental or somewhat semi-official or part of my job description, but I've never held an actual L&D title. So naturally, right now, I'm trying to combine those things and learning more about learning analytics and the data that training and learning and development is using or not using just seems like a very natural fit to me. I don't really want to get very technical, as the title has suggested. And I'm really also not going to talk too much about how to do data science specifically. That's really a subject for another day. And what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to help you think more like a data scientist. And being professorially inclined, I came up with this really neat definition of data science. And then last night I realized, you know what? I just need to take it down a notch. So here's how I think about data science. Imagine you have a coin, and a coin has two sides. And that's the way I think about data science. On the one side, we have the actionable insights part. That is taking data and actually basing your actions and decisions on it. And, to the other way around, also seeking out data that will allow you to inform your actions and decision making. So that's actionable insights. On the other side is what I like to call friendly skepticism. And that's just being inquisitive about data in general, but also about the data that you're dealing with or that you're being presented with. And I will try to combine those two things as I go through some of the thinking steps that I think are really important when we're dealing with data. So to the actionable insights, when we're talking about data, it really should start with a question. What is the data that I need to make a decision or take an action? And I want to really emphasize this point because there's a lot of data fetishism, let me call it that way, that, we're just gathering data, collecting data, and we're not really doing anything useful with it. So think about this question perhaps in an L&D sphere with course evaluations. What's the difference between asking your learners, did you like this course, or did you like the trainer or the instructor, versus asking, what are you able to do based on this training? So if you want to just give me an idea of what you think the difference is, just let us know in the chat. So what's the big difference between asking, did you like this training or did you like the instructor versus what are you able to do based on this training? I want to introduce you to a somewhat strange concept. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called falsifiability. And this was developed by a 20th century philosopher. His name was Karl Popper. He focused mainly on philosophy of science. And I'm going to read the quote to you, and then I'll explain what I think it means. Insofar as scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. So essentially what he's saying, when we take data and we're going to try to prove something or try to show something, the problem lies with that trying to confirm a theory. What we want to do is to actually find the truth about things, is to disconfirm a hypothesis or a theory. And this is really important when you examine data, because a lot of people make that mistake. They look at data, they look for the things that confirm whatever their hypothesis was or whatever their thinking was, or perhaps their, hope was. And they don't, when they find some data that speaks to that, they're like, okay, great. They don't look so much for the alternative explanations or the things that might actually disconfirm their beliefs. So this goes to the skeptical insights, friendly skepticism part of the data science coin, but it's also obviously connected to the flip side of that, which is actionable insights. If we're just going to take data and confirm what we already think is true, we're probably not going to derive very good action from that, or the actions that we take are going to be pretty biased, and so we're not going to get a good, a truthful result, so to speak. So I want to break the next things down into thinking about data and then thinking about measurement, because those two things are kind of, they're obviously related, but there are separate questions to ask about that. So when we want to derive actionable insights, but we also need to be inquisitive about our data, the first thing we want to ask, well, what is the right data that I need in this particular context, or for the use or goal that I have in mind? Consider, for instance, in L&D, we might wonder whether we want to spend money on training current employees, on upskilling them, or we want to spend money on buying new talent. In other words, hiring new people to fill a certain skill gap that we have in the organization. If we take a data approach, a data-driven approach from that context, then we're already going to see we'll need multiple measures to figure out what we need to do in this respect. So the question frames not just where we're going to go with our data inquiry, but also what data to focus on, and what data perhaps to set aside for that. And it might seem obvious to you, but I want to stress the point that not all data is useful, and you don't always need all data that's available. In fact, what you want to do is focus on the data that's most relevant to what you're the question that you're trying to answer, versus, looking at the universe of data that's available. And then we want to ask, remembering this concept of falsifiability, how can we ask our questions such a way that we're not pre-confirming some belief that we have about what the data is going to show us? And I'm going to go into that a little bit more when I talk about measurement. And related to that is looking at what your data actually looks like that you have at your disposal, or that you're going to collect, and how clean that data is. Actually, data scientists tend to spend most of their time on cleaning data, and it's sometimes the least exciting part about it, but it's extremely important. Taking it down a notch, if you're dealing a lot with surveys, you might also find that the data you collect isn't exactly clean with surveys. A lot of times you've got just weird values in there, or especially when you have text fields in surveys, you know, there might be some things that don't make sense in there that the respondent entered. And if your survey hasn't been constructed properly, you might find answers that contradict one another, or answers that are not exactly, well, answering the thing that you want to answer. So, you know, I don't want to go into survey construction, but that's kind of a problem with surveys a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with text data. I apologize, that's my work phone. We're just going to ignore it. So cleaning the data and making sense of values that don't make sense, and perhaps taking them out, replacing them, or if you have a lot of missing values, figuring out how to deal with those, that's going to be really, really important before you do any type of analysis. And then whether you're collecting data or you're looking at data that's already been collected, asking yourself, well, is this data actually correct? Does it make sense? Or do we need to question some parts of this data, or perhaps all of it? Again, this goes back to my point about friendly skepticism. It's not like you're trying to rip apart a nice cake, but you're trying to poke it a little bit to make sure that the value that you want to derive from the data is actually real value. And lastly, we collect a lot of data, and I'm actually really curious if you want to type this in the chat. We collect a lot of data, but then we either don't do anything with it, or it's actually not very actionable to begin with. Tell me in the chat if that's something that you're experiencing right now, or that you have experienced, and maybe give me some examples. Are you asked to report on data, or are you reporting on data, or it's data being reported to you that you really can't do anything substantial with, or that it can inform in a meaningful way your actions and decision making? Also, if you have questions, let me just get through my part, because I get discombobulated. We'll talk about your questions at the end. All right, let's talk about measurement. Imagine I said to you, it's 540 miles to Chicago. You're going to think to yourself, okay, from where? Okay, which Chicago? I think there are actually multiple Chicagos. Anyways, that's not very useful, is it? But if I said it's 540 miles to Chicago from St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm pretty sure that's wrong, but let's just go with it for a minute. That's more useful to you. What I've done there is given you a baseline, and the baseline is, from Minnesota or from St. Paul. So the first thing to do when you're doing measurements is to establish a baseline. And hopefully in L&D, that's something that you're already doing. So for instance, if you're starting a training program, establishing where your learners are at before they actually go through your training program or your course or whatnot. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard or next to impossible to tell if the training had any impact whatsoever. Now, you think that's probably common sense, but I see a lot of data reports or analyses where it's actually not very clear whether a baseline was taken. And that's pretty problematic. And also, when you're looking at data or analyses of data, ask yourself, did they take a baseline? Did they establish a starting point, so to speak? And if they did not, is there a reasonable explanation for why they did not? Does it make sense that they didn't take a baseline? The second question you want to ask yourself is actually a two-part question. What is being investigated and what is being measured? Unsurprisingly, those two things are often not the same. Especially in learning and development, we are looking at concepts that can't really be measured directly. Let's take learning retention, for example. Now, if I measure the circumference of your heads before I give you training and then after the training, and the circumference of your head got slightly bigger, then I could say, well, your head size increased because you retained some learning. Obviously, that's a very exaggerated example, but that's one way that I decided I'm going to measure learning retention, which is really hard to measure directly. So what is being investigated versus what is being measured will show you some problems in the way that the person doing or the investigators went about collecting data. So in not just in learning and development, but also in social sciences in general, we're dealing with mental or psychological concepts, and none of these things can be measured directly. So we come up with some sort of proxies. Like in my exaggerated example, it's measuring the circumference of someone's head. And the question is, does that really make sense? Does the way I have defined this thing that I want to measure, or have operationalized in data speak, this concept that I want to measure, make sense? And a lot of times you will find that it doesn't, or that it's biased, or that it's politically motivated, unfortunately, or that it's just not very well thought out. Or to be more benevolent about it, it's a way of measuring something that sounds okay, that's fairly close, maybe. It's an imperfect proxy, but it's not fully fleshed out, or not the best choice for measuring this thing that we're trying to measure. I also want to give you a warning. That's proxies that are, in other words, these stand-in things that we measure for something that we can't measure directly can actually have negative consequences. In learning and development, my most favorite example, and I don't mean that in the positive sense, is measuring the effectiveness or evaluating the effectiveness of teachers based on standardized test scores of the students. I don't want to go into why I think this is not a good way to ascertain it, but if you are a teacher and you've dealt with it, I'm sure you can give us some examples of why this might have negative consequences. And lastly, this proxy thing, in other words, what we're taking as a stand-in for measuring what we're really trying to learn about should be made transparent and explicit in the data analysis. Again, if you think about it more benevolently, some people might just sort of assume, okay, this makes sense to people that you would operationalize your measurement, your concept this way. But also, there are people who want to have a certain result or show a certain result, and they don't want to expose the weakness in their analysis too much. So they may choose not to be as transparent or explicit about what they actually measured. Another example might, I already talked about the learning retention example. So, but another example that relates to measurement is evaluating vendors or evaluating learning management systems or course packets outside course developers. If you need to make some decisions about where to put your budget, you might want to do that, and you probably should be doing it. But what kind of measures would make sense for that to get a good evaluation going? Do you need just one measurement? For instance, you could use the adoption for course developers. You could use the adoption rate, meaning the number of courses that are being consumed by your learners over the total number of learners. So that's an adoption rate. Or are there other measurements that you might want to include to get a good picture of whether this course vendor or LMS or whatever is worth your time? Next point about measurement is probably something you've heard a lot, and that is your measurement valid and reliable? That's a big topic, and I don't really want to dive too much into it because it would take, a book. But reliable means, is it consistently measuring the same thing? And valid essentially means, is it actually measuring what it is supposed to measure? It turns out that for a lot of things in social sciences, and I'm going to just learning science is kind of apart from the biological aspect, it's more of a social science endeavor, produces a lot of concepts and theories and measures that are questionable on the reliability and validity front, or at least there are issues that need to be acknowledged. Learning and measurement specifically, here's an example. If you want to measure learning engagement or learner engagement, well, there's a bunch of different ways you could measure it, but are those actually measuring what you want to measure? In other words, are those actually telling you something meaningful about learner engagement? So what could you measure for learner engagement? Say in the LMS, logins, amounts of content being viewed, social posts or discussion posts, attainment of badges, all of that, or something else. I really want to think critically about the measure that you're looking at or the pool of measures that you're looking at, and is that going to be a valid I'm just going to stop saying that word because it's way too early to jumble my letters. And is that really getting close to what you're trying to measure, or explanatory enough? Engagement is kind of a hot topic in learning and development and in talent development and in HR. And there are good measures. Okay, there are better and worse measures of it, but it's definitely a problematic thing to capture. All right. I want to go through a few other things here. In terms of measurement, are you using, or have the investigators used a sample size that's large enough? And learning and development, that's, from what I've seen, a problem oftentimes, right? If you're in a large organization, you have a lot of people that regularly go through training, this is going to be easier than if you have a really small organization, especially if you're in a shop where you're, as the learning and development person or instructional designer, you're doing everything. So I don't think that you need to throw measurement away because you don't have a large enough sample size, but it is something to think about and to acknowledge in your analysis that you probably don't have sufficient data to really to have a good level of certainty about what you're seeing in the data. And also, again, that's kind of a problem if you're in a smaller organization. Are you able to use a control group that is a group of people, for instance, who didn't go through your training, so you can see the difference between what happens with training and what happens without training? In larger organizations, that's going to be easier. But if you're able to do it, I strongly encourage you to try doing that when you're measuring learning outcomes or learning effectiveness. On the flip side, evaluating other people's analyses of data, is the methodology or the experimental design that was used transparent? If you look at data vendors, or vendors that regularly produce research and analysis that when various fields that they're selling to various people in the field, this can be a problem because these organizations want to make their methodology proprietary. And, it's problematic in my view because you can't evaluate thoroughly enough if the way they measured, the thing that they wanted to or said they were going to measure was reliable and valid or well constructed. So I'm always a little, I take these sort of data analyses that, organizations sell with a grain of salt or a friendly amount of skepticism. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is interpretation. Again, that's a big topic, but think about interpretation as the so what question. So, if someone reports we had a 95% satisfaction rate with our training program, you might want to ask a few questions. One, okay, what do you attribute that satisfaction rate to? And two, are there other things that could have led to that satisfaction rate? Favorite example, I love the cookies and the toilets were clean. And that's why I'm giving this training program a 9 out of 10. So again, it's important to ask the so what question, because just because people were satisfied with your training program, that doesn't mean they were satisfied for the right reasons. And it also doesn't mean that you can really draw any actionable insights or decisions from the result of this data analysis or data exploration. So when I ask, so what, I ask, okay, we have all these results that you're reporting to me, but, what am I going to do with this? And the context really matters. I remember way back when I started in social media analytics, the big thing of the day was content is king. And my feeling was always, I don't think that's the way to go about it. I think if anything is king, it should be context. And so I think that context matters most when it comes to interpreting data, because it's going to show you whether you can actually do something sensible with the analysis, or whether, quite frankly, the analysis is worth your time. And as L&D professionals, like most professionals, you probably are short on time anyways, and data collection and data analysis takes time. And so it better be useful by the time you're done with it. Another thing about interpretation, and then I will just stop for questions, is looking at the language that's being used in your interpretation or somebody else's interpretation. Anytime I see the word proof, I hesitate, because going back to the dear Karl Popper and falsifiability, most of the time what we're doing with data isn't going to prove anything, because there can always be other things that could contribute to the result that you're getting, that at least need to be thought of or considered. And it could also be the case that you will, sometime down the road, find that what you thought you proved actually turns out to be wrong. There's this famous example of the Black Swan, Nassim Taleb, but it essentially is, for the longest time, people thought there were only swans that were white. So, when that's because we've only seen white swans, that proves that swans can only be white. Obviously, that's pretty fallacious reasoning, but it actually happens a lot. And then somebody found a black swan, and, well, the whole theory about swans can only be white went out the window. So going into data analysis or interpretation from the perspective of proving anything is a very problematic thing. So when you see that language being used, just, stop and, think about how seriously you should take the conclusions that are being drawn from the data that's being investigated. Also, a lot of times there's causal language that's being applied that's not appropriate. So, correlation versus causation. And my favorite pet peeve is using language. This applies particularly to the social sciences space, that says our person is a, the person is a versus the person does a. So say we're talking about at-risk learners. I really dislike that phrase, because people aren't at-risk learners. They exhibit behaviors that might impair their learning, but saying they're at-risk learners is really something, at the very least, it's too strong. So thinking about, okay, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about behaviors versus traits of people, or preferences is going to be, it's a subtle point, I admit that, but I think it's important because it might influence how strongly you're inclined toward taking action based on that data, or even the severity of perhaps your intervention or the nature of your intervention, say, for instance, in the case of at-risk learners. Okay. I covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. I can definitely talk about more examples with respect to L&D in terms of measurements and whether they make sense or not, or what kind of things you want to look out for. But I'm really more interested in what your thoughts are, what your questions are. And so let's just go there. Let me see. Do I see any questions in here?
I'm going to jump in here real quick, Anja. I do want to ask you, though, we have that poll question. Do you need to become more confident dealing with data in your job? Do you have any ideas, like why do you think people aren't confident with dealing with data in their job? I mean, I'm sure that there's a variety of reasons, but what's your assessment of that?
Well, so, I mean, I kind of talked about my example of my math problem, my numbers problem, and I don't think that I'm the only one with that. And I see this, I've seen this a lot in social sciences too. It's a lot of those people are just more comfortable with thinking more about thinking more conceptually or abstractly, or thinking more about qualitative things rather than quantitative things. And there's probably also some legacy, particularly on the part of women, in terms of feeling capable of dealing with numbers. I mean, at least I experienced some of that in school very early on. Some of my teachers were just, let's just say women were kind of, if they weren't good at numbers, it was sort of like, well, that's to be expected.
Yeah.
So there's some legacy of that. But I also think that in K through 12, there may just not be enough reasoning skills being taught that help you make sense of numbers, that help you put those into some kind of context rather than dealing with raw quantities. And that's kind of what I was trying to say in the beginning. Philosophy helped me add that context. So I actually started getting excited about numbers and started getting excited about quantities. And so data literacy, or just sort of that sense of, I know what data means or what numbers mean or what people are trying to tell me when they tell me certain numbers, it's definitely something that I think in an educational context we need to work on.
Right. Joe actually has a question in the Ask a Question area that relates to that, I think. But I want to, you guys, the chat has been really great with comments. Adam and Kim and Joe, thanks so much for posting in there. But like Adam is saying, HR is focused on jobs, skills, and competencies, but I think they are too broad. We should focus on tasks as the atomic elements of work. Do you think this is a better approach?
It depends. I think context matters. I'm going to say that again. I don't know much about HR analytics. I know that HR has been making some strides on the analytics front. But I think that, at least from my experience, Joe might be onto something, because I find the view is often really more myopic. It's like, we need to put people in some kind of boxes, i.e. job descriptions, and figuring out whether, they have capabilities that are, that can be applied to various different projects or job descriptions or whatever. That's something that I think HR needs to look at more closely, because it also affects your internal talent marketplace. And it certainly could definitely influence that question that I posed in an example, which is, should you be training people inside your organization, or should you be hiring outside talent? And, but there are more questions that could be reasonably asked on the task front. It's just a matter of how do you measure that? And if you can come up with some reasonable measures, I think that you can probably make some headway in that aspect.
I love what Adam just posted here. Users want learning that relates to their jobs, but we don't know what their job is.
Yeah, and again, I think that's the point about job descriptions. I think that, but I mean, to be fair to departments like human resources, especially in a large organization where you have a lot of different people doing, fulfilling a lot of different roles, and they are not experts in these roles. And maybe they also have hiring managers who are not experts on the roles of their subordinates, or who are even really trained in discovering skills and skill sets, or hiring for skill sets rather than roles. That's definitely a problem that I think feeds into that.
Nice. Kim has an interesting comment here. Maybe L&D attracts people who are more focused on the subjective, whereas data is more objective, and maybe an objective focus is seen as being negative.
That's a good point. I think so. A lot of the things that I talked about were, friendly skepticism. And I do think that there's a tendency with data to kind of want to make yourself look good, for better, and to kind of use it as a way to justify your existence. And particularly in L&D, having negative results when you're already struggling to, get your budget every year, or to make the case for training in your organization, that's probably going to feel disadvantageous. I don't look at it that way, because I think that ultimately, if you want to create effective training, you need negative results, and you need to be aware of them, because, you learn, I think anyways, most from your mistakes. And it's that thought of falsifiability that I talked about, having a critical view toward what you're doing and whether it's actually working, and maybe assuming it's probably not working as well as I think it is, or as I want it to.
I like it. Yeah, like Kim is saying, we don't want to measure because what if it shows we're failing?
Yeah. And also, I think this is a leadership issue. If you are failing, if you feel you're afraid of showing failing results, then your leadership in the organization has failed. Because your leadership should be encouraging you to find as much insight, positive or negative, from your data that you're producing. And they should be supportive of you trying to draw actionable insights from negative results. So I really would push against the people who are trying to put blame on you, or whatever, push responsibility on you. It's about the environment that the leadership in your organization creates. And if that sucks, no wonder you're afraid of data.
Yeah. Adam saying, if you're afraid of failing, your leadership has failed. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, let me ask you this question that Joe had posted in Q&A. He's asking, seriously speaking, in the age of everyone yelling fake news, how do you convince people that real data is actually real? In other words, when people are invested in believing something and no amount of data will convince them otherwise, how do you deal with this?
So first of all, I feel you. As a data person, as a passionate person about data, as a person passionate about data, yeah, I feel many days I want to go to bed crying. But here's the thing. People who don't want to be convinced by evidence don't want to be convinced by evidence. So that's probably not the best use of your time trying to turn those people around, unfortunately. Now, okay, you can always probe, like, how firm are they holding on to that belief? But my unfortunate experience has been that those people, if they get convinced of the opposite, or if they're willing to take opposite evidence into consideration, it usually takes some kind of big event, something that impacts them personally. And, like with COVID, you saw some people were like, that's nothing, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden they got sick, or a family member got sick, and they're like, holy crap, this shit is real. So that's unfortunately not the best situation, but that's kind of what happens. The people who are on the fence, the kind of questions that I outlined are probably the kind of questions that you want to ask. And maybe you're not giving them a laundry list like I did. But, you kind of start with that and see where you're going. But making them comfortable questioning things and questioning their own beliefs is going to be key there. So not taking a sort of like adversarial or combative approach would be useful. And trust me, that's difficult for people who are really passionate about the things that they're passionate about. And so I struggle with that too.
Yeah. Adam saying, never argue with crazy people because your conclusions have to match their assumptions. I love that, Adam. In fact, he mentioned here, I had to jot this down. He said, the so what question, that should be the title of Anja's book. The so what question.
I actually got this from from economics. I studied economics for a little while, and there were some pretty smart economists that also actually could write well for a general public. And one of them, and I just can't remember off the top of my head who it was, said, well, if you're looking at evaluating public policy, or, talk about economic, data, asking yourself, so what, will go a long way to inform what kind of decision-making you're going to engage in based on that data. And, if you are so inclined listening to politicians, you will see they fail miserably on asking the so what question. But that's another topic that goes into motivations and stuff.
How about your perspective? I mean, so you have a philosophy background and then applying it to L&D. How have you been able to sort of pursue that? Is there any influences in that arena at all that have helped you with like sort of cultivating your ideas?
Well, so, I mean, I've joined this community not too long ago, and I was kind of trying to find, okay, where could I fit, here? And so I started thinking about learning analytics, and I started poking and asking a lot of people how they feel about the learning analytics that exist or that they're using. And I figured out that a lot of people were feeling like this is a lacking area. But unfortunately, it seems to be sort of a desert of resources in this respect, or at least you find some things, like a handful of things, talked about and put out by the same people. And while those people are experts, there's nothing wrong with listening to the experts. I do think that having more people talk about that from different walks of professions or whatnot going into LMD would be very helpful, because, you know, you get kind of tunnel vision once you reach a certain stage of expertise. Mm-hmm. So I haven't really found the best place yet for me. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping it'll turn up. But one of the things that I'm hoping is having these conversations with the community is figuring out how I can be most helpful and what kind of resources I might be able to offer you guys, so you can make more headway. And actually, Louis, can you put up the exit poll real quick, which is, I wanted to ask, how are you feeling more confident dealing with data in your job after this presentation? Well, you know, after this session. That would be something I'm curious about.
Okay, I'm writing and typing it in so that people can find dealing with data after this presentation. All right, almost there.
Yeah. Dealing with crazies.
Okay, so I got it in there, you guys, if you want to add to that poll question. Let's see, Adam saying, Anja, you're great at tying together concepts in a unique and very usable way. And I thought it was brilliant, Anja. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. Yeah, I would love to follow up on this a little bit more. I found it absolutely compelling, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to do this. You know, so if you have anything else at all that you want to follow up with, anything like that, I'd love for you to be able to continue to showcase it here. It was brilliant.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to really want to encourage you guys, you know, to talk to me about what things you're struggling with, what things you're interested in having me talk about. Because, I mean, trust me, there's a lot to talk about, but I don't want to put something out there that's not really as useful to you as it can be as you're actually doing your job.
Right.
And also, I wanted to mention that I am working on a job aid for this. So it will be up on my LinkedIn, and we're going to try to maybe figure out how to link it to this presentation. So watch out for that. Connect with me on LinkedIn. And you know, I just want to give you some reference to work off of rather than you having to go back to this presentation.
I also do. I can add, like, this Friday, you guys, I'm doing a holiday social, right? We're going to be using a platform called AirMeet, which has been really fun for me to be testing out and playing around with. I think it's going to work really, really well for networking. But Anja is going to have a virtual table in there. You can sort of think of it as like a breakout room, sort of. You can pop in and chat with Anja on Friday, right? So, and I can't remember what table number it is, but once you get into the interface and you hit up the lounge, you can see it. We have like almost a dozen people that have tables in there. And then there's also a speed networking feature where you can kind of just jump into this whirlwind of, like, I don't know, you just end up getting matched, and then you could talk for 5 minutes, and then you got to move on to the next person. I'm really excited to see how that works out. And then we're going to wrap it up with just like a little sort of holiday thank you in a short broadcast. So yeah, you guys, on Friday, you can talk to Anja in the holiday social if you want to jump in. And other than that, Anja, thanks again so much for doing this. We'll talk more, and everybody really appreciate you coming in today. Look out for that job aid. We'll make sure that it's easily accessible to you. And with that, hopefully we'll see you on Friday. All right. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again, Anja. It was wonderful.